There is a powerful strain of anti-EU sentiment in Britain. But is it enough to turn the anti-EU UK Independence Party into a credible political force in the looming general election? My guest today is UKIP's erstwhile leader, now their most high-profile parliamentary candidate, Nigel Farage. He revels in his role as a troublemaking MEP in Brussels. But can he convince as a serious politician? Nigel Farage, welcome to Hard Talk. How do you transform yourself and your party from the single-issue anti-EU campaign into a credible political party?
Well, we've been doing that for some years, slowly but surely. You know, when you're new in politics, you have to establish yourself as a brand. And I think by coming second in the European elections last year across the entire UK, we have established ourselves. If you don't think Britain should be part of the European Union, then we're the party for you. But of course, as you get bigger, and as the likelihood becomes greater that if we had a referendum on this subject, that the British would opt for a different relationship, then you're right. What people want to know is, how would you run the United Kingdom? Where would you see our place with the rest of the world? And we've been slowly doing it, but you know, it's about evolution. It can't happen overnight.
But the precedent isn't good, is it? Because I was just checking the figures. In 2004, your European election performance was also very strong. You got 2.6 million votes. But the year later, when there was a British general election, you went down to, what, 600,000 votes. You didn't come anywhere near winning a seat in the Westminster Parliament.
That was very different.
Why?
The reason was we'd had a big spike in 2004. We had a couple of big celebrity supporters and backers and candidates. And it took us much further, much faster than we ever thought we'd go. But by the same token, those people also led us to a position where we approached the 2005 election as a party that was split down the middle. It didn't have any money. We were in a very weak position.
I don't recall you saying that at the time, but it's interesting you would contest that now.
Well, no, hang on a second. I mean, you know, at the end of 2004, I admitted very publicly that UKIP had serious problems.
I don't think you ran a campaign in 05 saying vote for the party that split down the middle. But let's leave that by the by, because I want to get to a development of the same point. I've been looking at the polls. I'm sure you have too, because you're standing in the seat of Buckingham here in the UK, and it's difficult to define your support, but you're roughly between 5 and 6% on those polls that bother to measure the UKIP vote. That again is not impressive, is it?
Well, that would be more than double what we got last time in the general election, so that would be progress, albeit not enough. And also, I mean, bear in mind that those polls also include within them Scotland, where at the moment we're not a very strong party, and the reason for that, of course, is the word independence means something different up there. We are making steady progress, and actually, if you look at those polls, there have been 2 polls in the last week showing others on between 15 and 20%. So you know, that 5 to 6% figure is at the lower end of expectations.
But would you agree, and this again is polling evidence, that in the end Europe is not playing as an issue in the UK general election? If you ask people what they're going to vote on, it's quite clear they're going to vote on the state of the economy, on the arguments about spending and cuts. They're going to vote on what they think will deliver jobs, and Europe isn't on the list.
Well, of course it isn't, to the degree that the Conservative Party and Labour parties will not even talk about the European dimension. Our job is to make people understand that if we talk about the economy, there is a huge link to our membership of the EU. If we talk about immigration, which is number 2 on the list of voters' concerns, we can't have our own immigration policy and be part of the European Union. I mean, goodness me, we've had a big debate in Britain this week about a crazed drug that kids have been taking, and a few have died. We can't even ban that in this country because we have to apply for permission to the EU. So what we're saying to people is, look, the fact the big parties are not discussing this doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
Well, let's unpick it a little bit, and let's focus on the economy, because every single poll puts that front and centre of people's concerns. Your manifesto is a pretty extraordinary document, if you don't mind me saying. I mean, we're facing a budget deficit in this country of more than 12% of GDP. The budget deficit is close to £170 billion this year, and you propose to slash taxes for the rich. You want a flat tax of 31% across the nation, which means the rich pay much less.
Well, I think actually...
Does that make any sense?
I think the salient point of our tax policy is not that. The salient point is we want to raise the level at which people start paying tax to £11,500 a year. We've been campaigning on that for the last 3 years. So, in fact, what we're doing is we're saying to the poorest paid in society, you can work a 35 to 40-hour week on the minimum wage and not pay any tax at all, because the key thing to us is that we incentivize people to get them off benefits.
Yeah, but the point is, as soon as the people who are earning modest wages, average sort of wages in the UK, as soon as they start paying tax, they're paying much more tax under your system than they would before. And they juxtapose that and they contrast that with the rich. The rich will be paying unbelievably less tax than they would under the current regime.
I think you should read it more carefully, because actually what we're doing is abolishing national insurance, which was a con anyway, and rolling that in with income tax. The big beneficiaries of the UKIP tax policy would be the 4 million lowest earners, who would be taken completely out of the tax system. Now, coming to your point about big earners and high earners, you know, what we saw all through the 1970s were Britain's brightest and best young people fleeing the country, going all over the world, because they weren't prepared to pay very high rates of tax. What we've had with a Labour government, and what we have with the Conservative opposition refusing to oppose, is we're seeing the rich, if you want to call them that, the high earners, paying more and more tax. And the signal that is sending to people is, isn't it time for the entrepreneurial to flee the country?
It's interesting that after we've seen the financial crisis, the financial meltdown, after we've seen the budget deficit spiral out of control, and everybody now concerned about the state of the public finances, that your message is that the rich should pay much less tax. Not only that, inheritance tax, which again massively benefits the rich as opposed to the poor, should be scrapped. There should be dividend tax relief reimposed. Yep. All of these measures which seem to be saying to the country, never mind the fact that the disparity between rich and poor is greater than it's ever been, we're going to make it even greater.
Well, our message to the rich is don't leave the country. We want, you know, very bright, hard-working people, successful people to stay in Britain and not to head off to Zurich, off to New York or wherever they're going. And they're going in real numbers. Let's not underestimate the number of high earners and able people that are fleeing these shores.
So inequality higher in the UK now than it's been for a long, long time, and you're saying, it doesn't matter to me, we're going to make it even higher.
We're the first political party to put a serious proposal on the table to get people off benefit and back to work, to take 4 million people totally out of taxation. And I tell you, because of that, the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable's party, have almost matched us with those ideas. So actually, we're leading the way. Listen, that alone is going to cost 25 to 30 billion pounds. But the point is...
Yeah, and you're happy to tell me that, given that we do currently face a budget deficit of £170 million a year.
The classic mistake that everybody makes is they think, if we cut taxes, we'll lose revenue. All the lessons from the early 1980s, all the lessons from the Baltic states in the 1990s are that if you cut taxes, people stop evade paying.
Well, Richard Murphy, who's just been running some of your numbers, Director of Tax Research UK, says he doesn't believe your figures can possibly add up. When he looks at your tax policy and your spending policy, it doesn't add up.
Well, the way that it adds up is if we promote growth. You know, all of this was said back in the early 1980s and the mid-1980s, when there were massive tax cuts, if you remember, on income tax. We were told the British economy would lose all this income. Actually, it generated more income. And what we want to do, I mean, on the big economic question, we want to cut the size of the state sector. We want radical cutbacks in public spending, and we want to incentivise private business.
You certainly want radical cuts in public spending, in the sense that you set a target of, what, £500 million you want the government to spend, which is well over 25% less than it is on current levels. Again, the difficult thing for me is that when I go through your detailed proposals on public spending, I see an awful lot of commitments to new spending. For example, major new spending commitments on defence, on prisons, border police, things like that. but very little specific evidence of anything you're going to cut at all. And of course, you're going to have to cut massively to meet this target you've set.
I mean, we would have to. To meet those targets, there would need to be huge cutbacks in quangos.
Something that Britain's never seen before. The Tories and Labour are arguing about cuts which might, in some departments, end up representing a 12 to 15% cut in real terms over the next 3 or 4 years. You're talking about 30 to 35% cuts.
Yeah, that's right. That's
across
right.
the board.
Well, just look at how the state's grown since '97. 850,000 new jobs in the public sector since 1997.
So why does your manifesto say that frontline services, particularly in the NHS, will not be affected?
Well, there are 8 million people working in our public services.
So you can deliver the NHS services without the people?
Of which only 2 million of the 8 million work directly in frontline services. And this really is the great disease within the public sector in this country at the moment, is this massive bureaucracy. Now, a lot of it, of course, is that we have to interpret such a mass of EU legislation. That's part of the problem. We also have our own disease of bureaucracy in this country. And what we're saying is there need to be massive cutbacks, that so much of what is done, so many of these quangos, frankly, aren't needed at all. And what we've got to do when that general election campaign starts is we've got to provide a list of those that we believe need to be acted.
But that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, we've predicated this discussion thus far on whether you can break through and convince the British people that you are a credible, coherent, serious political party. And frankly, your manifesto, with its lack of specificity on this particular issue of what you're going to cut, given the targets you've set yourself, doesn't leave you looking serious.
No. Well, hang on a second. The election hasn't started. And I just said a moment ago, we need to provide a list of those departments that need to be slashed, of those quangos that need to be abolished. And is it a serious, credible message to say that the state sector is far too big in this country, that it needs to be cut radically, and that we need to give incentives to people in the private sector to create real jobs? I think that argument has got real coherence.
Well, it's not serious if you say it, but in the next breath you say, by the way, NHS frontline services will be entirely ring-fenced. By the way, the armed forces are going to be increased by 25%.
That's the one area. The
25%. Well, border police as well. You're going to have to build more prisons because you want a lot more people up. And all of these different areas of public service, you're actually going to have to spend more. That's where you begin to look serious.
No, the one area where we say there need to be increases in the budget are defence. Yes, within other budgets, you know, some parts will be cut radically, some will increase in a small way, but the big area of increase would be defence.
Just a couple of other brief thoughts on your policies which go beyond pulling out of the European Union. One is climate change. You seem to be absolutely convinced as a party that climate change isn't happening, despite the overwhelming consensus of scientists. Still, despite the doubts that have been raised about some of the particular data sets, still the scientific consensus says climate change is happening, it's man-made, and it's very serious. But your party refuses to.
You were asking me a moment ago where the money was going to come from to pay for all of this, and of course we are wasting billions every year on climate change programs.
So cutting carbon emissions is absolutely not going to happen under any sort of UKIP government.
Whether climate change or a rise in temperature, which is what people are really talking about, whether rise in temperature is happening because of CO2 emissions, we think is pretty doubtful. But what we're absolutely certain of are the billions that are being spent to tackle it simply won't work. And the best example of this is this crazy project at a total cost of £100 billion, and some will come from the private sector, but most will come from taxpayer subsidy, this crazy idea that we need to build another 10,000 offshore wind turbines.
So vote UKIP.
It does not work.
All right, vote UKIP for fossil fuels forever.
Vote UKIP to immediately take nearly 20% off your electricity bill, because that's the hidden subsidy that is now going to fund renewable projects that don't work, and vote UKIP to go into a serious program of building nuclear energy and recognising.
Well, you can't build nuclear because you can't afford to subsidise the removal of all the toxic waste because you're cutting public spending by 30 or 40%.
And recognise in the short term that coal may well be very useful.
OK. Immigration. You've already mentioned it in this interview. You've tied it to your EU policy. You say the country must not, cannot and will not allow population to keep rising up to possibly 70 million by 2030 or near there. How are you going to stop that happening?
I mean, 70 million is almost an agreed figure now, because we've been on this projection now for several years, certainly since 2004.
How do you stop it?
Well, what you easily can stop is you can easily stop a net several 100,000 people a year coming to settle in the United Kingdom. What we don't do anymore, we don't properly draw a distinction between people coming to work here and people coming to settle here. And the first thing that's got to be said is that it is, and we as a party said this in 2003 and 4, that if you open up your door to poor countries in Eastern Europe, it will lead directly to a massive migratory flow. It has led to that migratory flow.
And what do you say to those businesses who rely across the agriculture sector, food processing, building, many other sectors, who rely on a steady supply of cheap, hard-working labour from overseas?
Well, you could, of course, operate a work permit scheme, which would be very, very strict, that you come into the country with a work permit, and when that work permit's run out, you go back to where you came from. We don't do that at the moment. We allow you to come in, to work, to settle, to bring your family and all the rest of it. That's the first thing that I would say to those businesses. And the second thing, and this is tied into a domestic problem, is, you know, I talked earlier about getting people who were on benefit, off benefit, and back to work. You suddenly would find that a lot more British people would want to be going for those jobs because it would be worth
if not removed their benefits.
No, I hadn't said that.
Well, that's the implication.
We've given them the incentive to get to work by raising the level at which they start paying tax.
All right.
So the two work together.
One message you, in your constituency fight, are delivering, and the party as a whole across the country, is this, that we are not politics as usual. We're different from the established parties, Labour, Lib Dems, Tories. In effect, they've all got the same problems. They're all locked into a system which we are going to challenge. How does that square with the record of UKIP, particularly in the European Parliament? Under your watch, for example, as leader of the party, 2 MEPs elected in the 04 class of MEPs were actually convicted of fraud.
Yeah, one you can't blame me for at all, because before he even took his seat in the European Parliament, we discovered there was a serious problem. We hadn't found out about the problem. The police checks hadn't brought up the difficulties that he was in, and we got rid of him. Boom, gone.
Doesn't say much about your party that he was an MEP candidate, successful, entered the Parliament under your banner, and actually you discovered within weeks that he was a crook.
Well, within days, actually. Within days of him being elected.
As I say, it doesn't say much about your party.
Well, what can you do? You know,
well, we're trying to establish whether your party is going to convince the public that it is a different, cleaner sort of politics.
We did the police checks on him, and nothing was revealed. Today, there is a thing called the Enhanced Criminal Records Bureau check. It didn't exist then. Had we had that, we'd have found out. And yes, OK, let's just deal with this head on. Yes, we had one of our intake of 2004 who abused the system. And I would say to people, you know, in every walk of life, in every company you've worked in, often in every family, you'll find a bad apple. The question is, how do you deal with it? And when I found out the extent of what this man had done, that he'd deliberately broken the rules, I got rid of him.
You say we've had one man who abused the system.
Yep.
You've also said in the past that you have claimed in expenses and allowances from Brussels since 1999, you said, it must be pushing £2 million.
Well, that's a direct misquote, and a deliberate misquote.
Well, it's a vast sum, you said, in a discussion with Dennis McShane. I don't know how much. Oh, Lord, it must be pushing £2 million. That's a direct quote.
Yeah, but not money that's gone to me. That's the point. And
well, we don't know where it's gone, do we? Because you've never agreed to an independent audit of all of that money.
It's gone to employees. And that was
how do we know?
That was where this was misquoted.
How do we know?
Oh, because how could I possibly have claimed that much in the course of 10 years?
Well, we don't know, because you've never agreed to an independent audit of where that money's gone.
Well, actually, if you look at my website today, you will see the figures I've got there.
I've looked at your website today. Yeah, but excuse me, we're talking about a huge amount of money from 1999. I've looked on your website. There is no accounting for that money, a truly extraordinary sum of money. And many people, even inside the party, frankly, believe you've abused the system.
No. Nobody inside the party believes I've abused the system.
Well, people inside the party who have been thrown out. John West, for example, who was a leading UKIP figure in Suffolk, he believes you have been conning the party.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that's absolutely wrong. Listen, I have, since 1999, there is no other British MEP that has travelled the length and breadth of this country more consistently than I've done, that has worked as hard as I have done. Nobody else in the old Parliament produced any figures at all. We are now producing those figures. They're up on my website. Over 85% of the EU money I get doesn't go to me, it goes to
With the greatest respect, Mr. Farage, I have spent an hour on your website this morning trying to find these figures. They're not there, or if they are there, they're hidden so far into the website they're unreachable.
No, they're not. What I haven't published are are the figures I pay to individual employees, but you can see the total sum that was claimed last year for employees, the total allowances that came to me, the vast majority have not gone to me. The money goes to pay for employees.
John West
Well, I'm sorry, but he's not a credible. He is not a credible witness. We've been through.
You didn't say that when he was a senior member of your party in Suffolk, did you?
Actually, I did, and we've been through a series of court cases with this man. He is a consistently litigious and difficult.
It is my view that Nigel Farage and many of the leadership of UKIP have been conning the public for years.
Well,
their trumpeted Euroscepticism is no more than a cynical ploy designed to fool people into voting them back onto the EU gravy
one thing
train.
for certain, if I wanted to have the good life and make money, I would not be doing this job. I was earning more money when I was 21 years old than I'm earning being an MEP. I have not done this for the money. I have made a huge personal financial sacrifice to do this job. Now, okay, it was my choice, but, you know, because you get some little ankle biter out in the regions who posts all this stuff on blogs, does not mean that it is true.
Let's, before we finish, bring it back to Europe.
No, can I finish, please?
No,
I've been there for 10 years. People like this have every year complained about me to Olaf, the European Union's anti-fraud people, who've come in and been through my figures, and I have done absolutely nothing wrong with those monies at all.
Final question, getting back to this serious, credible image you want to project for the party. Did it help when you stood up in the European Parliament, faced Mr. Van Rompuy, the new President of the European Council, and called him, he said he has the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk, and you said to him, you have the charisma of a damp rag. Childish insult. Does that further your political cause?
Well, have a look at what happens in the House of Commons every single week. Have a look at what happens in parliaments all over the world.
But I'm asking you a direct question.
Does that sort
of childish approach to politics, no substance, just insult, does that help your campaign to be a credible politician?
I'm sorry, I wouldn't accept that. If I hadn't said
well, what bit don't you accept? It was childish, it was insulting, it's certainly wasn't substantial.
I think that's part of normal give and take that goes on within a
personal abuse.
Well, it wasn't.
Does it? Well, of course it was.
I mean, no. So this is very strange, isn't it? You know, I can stand in the European Parliament, and all sorts of terms of abuse can be thrown at me. I make a mild, sort of half-jokey comment about this man's total lack of charisma, which is pretty evident to everybody, and this is suddenly an outrage. All I will tell you is that right across the world, we have had a huge feedback to that speech, and my basic question was, who on earth is this man?
What sort of feedback...
Hang
on, we're nearly out of time. I want to ask you something else. What sort of feedback have you had to the fact that you're now allied in this bloc, Europe for Freedom and Democracy, with MEPs who have a record of anti-Semitism, of anti-homosexual comments, of discriminatory comments on a whole range of issues? What sort of feedback have you had on that?
We've drawn some very careful lines in that Parliament, and there are many political parties who wanted to join our group that we have said no to. We do not want to be part of your group.
But for example, the Northern League, who've dismissed immigrants from Africa as bingo bongos, they've called for racial segregation on buses, they're acceptable.
The Northern League have all sorts of wild and woolly voices within them. They are, of course, in coalition.
But they passed your approval
threshold. They are, of course, in coalition with Mr. Berlusconi, so perhaps you better ask him that question. The Northern League...
I'd love to ask him, and asking you now.
The Northern League,
think that's all acceptable?
Do I think the Northern League is a racist political party? No. Do I think there are some people within the Northern League who say some things at times that are pretty silly? Yes. But, you know, you can make this argument of every group inside the European Parliament. The British Tories get this criticism, the British Labour Party get this criticism. There are different political cultures within Europe. The important thing for us has been to make sure that we have had leadership of the voice of opposition within that European Parliament since 2004, something which I believe we've used very effectively to highlight that people like Herman Van Rompuy are running our lives and they're not subject to the ballot box.
We're out of time. Nigel Farage, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Cheers.
Thank you.